going to start this, which is great, with a video from Congressman Curbelo, who recently introduced a Republican carbon tax bill that had 2 other Republican co-sponsors on it, as well as Senator Schatz from Hawaii, who has introduced a carbon tax dividend bill with Senator Whitehouse a while back, just to sort of set the flavor for talking about federal policy, the way forward, and some pieces here. They both would have liked to have been here but couldn't be here, so we're delighted that they did videos for this specific event right now. So we'll go to those. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Congressman Carlos Curbelo, representative for South Florida in the U.S. House of Representatives and co-founder of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person today, but I want to thank you for your interest in innovative policy solutions to lower carbon emissions and protect our environment, and I want to thank you for your leadership. Despite this time of deep political division and some days even political chaos, earlier this year I introduced a big, sober solution to address some of our country's greatest challenges. For years, Americans have been frustrated with our country's insufficient transportation infrastructure. Traffic congestion costs our economy billions of dollars each year, while diminishing quality of life for average Americans. Roads and bridges must be repaired and rebuilt, public transportation networks expanded, and airports modernized to secure a prosperous future for our country. The current administration has called for an ambitious infrastructure investment program, and Congress's response has been lukewarm at best. Another major concern for many Americans, especially among younger generations and those who live in coastal communities, is the reality of rising global temperatures, rising sea levels, and more extreme weather caused by the emission of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. Already, my constituents in South Florida are experiencing the effects of higher sea levels with chronic coastal flooding and saltwater intrusion in the Everglades, which threatens our drinking water supply. Also, ocean acidification is damaging coral reefs and threatening the livelihoods of fishermen and charter boat captains and all who rely on our tourism industry. So all of this is why I filed the Market Choice Act, which recognizes the cost of carbon dioxide emissions while at the same time repealing the regressive discriminatory gas tax, which overburdens Americans who drive traditional vehicles and fails to fully fund our nation's infrastructure needs. First, the bill would set the United States on a plan to reduce carbon emissions and not only fulfill but exceed the commitments set out under the Paris Agreement. According to the study from Columbia University, the $24 per ton price this bill would set on carbon with an annual 2% increase plus the Consumer Price Index would result in 27 to 32% reductions in carbon emissions by 2025 and 30 to 40% reductions by 2030. Second, the bill raises much needed revenue to modernize our national infrastructure, a bipartisan priority that remains elusive without a new influx of revenue. Under the gasoline tax, the Highway Trust Fund is projected to receive $407 billion over the next 10 years. Our bill would provide an additional $285 billion, along with an additional $18 billion for the Airways Trust Fund. This robust investment in American infrastructure will result in reduced travel times, improved logistical efficiency, and economic growth. Third, the bill would eliminate regressive, inefficient, and discriminatory taxes like the gasoline tax and the aviation fuel tax to capture the entire economy. While the gas tax disproportionately affects those of lower and middle incomes who can't afford higher efficiency vehicles like Teslas, our bill promotes equitable treatment for Americans driving traditional cars and ensures all Americans are contributing their fair share to our country's infrastructure needs. The bill also creates long-term regulation stability by establishing a moratorium on the EPA from finalizing and enforcing Clean Air Act regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, thus providing much-needed regulatory certainty for utilities and businesses and limiting economic repercussions of additional regulations. Trade partners would be held accountable by way of a border tax adjustment, a concept advanced in the past by the Speaker of the House and Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and American exporters will be held harmless to protect their competitiveness. Additionally, there will be more certainty for workers and business as a result of a rolling moratorium on the EPA's regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. Lower-income Americans will be protected from higher utility bills, and assistance will be provided for displaced workers. In addition to all of this, modeling shows that under this policy, emissions reductions will exceed the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement. We've already seen enormous support for this kind of solution. Environmental and climate change advocates across the political spectrum have called it bold, innovative, and sensible. 34 diverse companies representing a wide cross-section of the U.S. economy welcomed this legislation for its contribution to the discussion. I truly believe that one day my Market Choice Act or legislation similar to it will become law. We simply owe it to every American, and especially to younger generations who are understandably concerned about the future. It's why in Congress I'm working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to debate and support market-based solutions, investments, and innovations that could mitigate the effects of climate change and make our nation more resilient. And it's why your being here today is so important. Your passion and leadership can make a difference for a stronger economy and a healthier and cleaner planet. Thank you so much.
Okay, and now we have the video by Senator Schatz, right?
Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank Terry List Stoll and everyone at GAP for hosting this important event and for leading on climate. I'm hoping that since you're here today, you'll agree that a price on carbon is the best option that we have for bipartisan action on climate change. It's simple and it's straightforward. It's market-driven and business-friendly, and it doesn't expand regulations. In the Congress, I've introduced a carbon fee bill with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse that can appeal to both sides of the aisle. Our bill sets a meaningful price on carbon, one that's significant enough to change people's behaviors. Our bill will charge $50 per ton of CO2 equivalents, a price that would rise by 2% plus inflation every year. It protects American competitiveness through border adjustment taxes, and it lays the groundwork for communities to transition to a low-carbon economy in two essential ways. First, it provides up to $800 per person per year through a tax refund. And second, it provides grants that will help low-income and rural households lower their energy expenses and support job training and worker transition assistance. We're going to keep working on this bill until Congress catches up with the public and decides to take action. The good news is that there are signs that the dam is starting to break. We have strong bipartisan support outside of the Congress, from think tanks to big and small businesses. Even the big oil companies have formed a lobbying group and started to advocate for a carbon fee. We should approach some of these efforts with caution, but more importantly, we have to stay optimistic that this is a possible path forward and continue to push for action in Congress. And I know with your group's help, we're going to get there. Thanks very much.
Okay, terrific. We get to go a tiny bit over because we had to share time with those two guys, so which we were delighted to do. I want to just say a couple words of introduction. I'm Christina DiConcini, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs at the World Resources Institute. And for disclosure, we are enthusiastic about the introduction of the Curbelo bill. I was on Marketplace yesterday talking about that because it's been 10 years since we've had any Republican engagement in any meaningful way on climate, and we believe that a price on carbon is an essential piece of moving climate policy forward, and that it has to be bipartisan, as obviously everyone on this panel does too. But so that's, the reason why I'm saying that is this won't be an interesting discussion if I just throw a bunch of softball questions. So I'm going to intentionally ask my friends here challenging questions about, so that it's clear I'm not a Pollyanna and I don't have rose-colored glasses on, just so that we can have a real discussion about what we're really facing here and trying to get this across the finish line at the federal level. Okay, so that's my disclosure, and this is sort of the crystal ball session. But I'm going to try to ask each of our panelists slightly different questions, so we're not too repetitive, and I also want to leave a lot of time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with you, Mark, and we all applaud and recognize that CCL has done more than anybody in this space, but the difficult questions for you are, what if a lot of the Republican members of the Climate Solutions Caucus aren't reelected in November, diminishing the possibilities of bipartisan support? Do you think there's going to be other Republicans getting on the Curbelo bill, and why or when? And also the what is your anticipation if the Democrats take control of the House? In terms of moving the bipartisan conversation forward?
Okay, well, let's start with the Climate Solutions Caucus. There's some members of the caucus on the Republican side that are retiring. There's some that will probably lose their race. So does that affect our ability to work across the aisle? And we don't think so. If you just look at time frame, for us to get Curbelo as the Republican lead, it took 3 years of us working in his district. We started the caucus with Representative Deutsch, and it was 3 years of bringing business leaders in, community leaders in. It was 3 years till we had one Republican. Coming out of the 2016 election, there were 6 Republicans left on the caucus. There's 43 now. So that we know our ability to build that caucus up quickly has accelerated significantly. So yeah, it could hurt, but it's not a damaging blow. And we think some people will be gone, but we'll be able to build that up. I think that it's really significant that 3 Republicans believe that it is politically smart for them to introduce a carbon tax this year. In Curbelo's own case, the Cook report went him from a level to leaning R, and that's significant that Cook is now saying that helped Curbelo to introduce a bill. I don't necessarily know if any more Republicans will jump on the bill, but it is really significant that Republicans feel that the political winds have shifted enough that they can introduce a carbon tax and be safe with it. What about the future? I don't know. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the past tells us about that. So we have about 1,600 meetings with congressional offices every year, and we debrief those meetings, and we take them back to Congress to show how their views on dealing with climate change, specifically a fee on carbon with all the money going back to households, evolves over time. So 5 years ago, the most frequently raised issue for us was China, which is essentially, if we do something and other countries don't, will that hurt us? That is now still an issue, but it's not at the top anymore. The last couple of years, it went from the China to the dividend, as in why this wouldn't work, to how would you make it work. The last 2 years, by far the most frequently raised issue was the Climate Solutions Caucus itself. So it seems that there's a lot of appetite and interest in Congress of how would working across the aisle work. Now, we don't have the full analysis for this year so far, but we do have 2 key committees of jurisdiction: Ways and Means in the House, Senate Finance. Overwhelmingly, those people were interested in, first, the Climate Solutions Caucus, the second, the dividend, and third, really interesting this year, was pollution and health, which we believe is a winning issue in a bipartisan fashion because pollution and health isn't a Republican or a Democratic issue. I think that lends itself towards bipartisanship, and I don't know what will happen next year, but everything we're going to do is to try and focus on something bipartisan.
Terrific, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to turn now to you, Josiah. You represent R Street, which is a center of right organization that's long supported a price on carbon. So I'm going to make you respond from all the Republicans. And my first question is, what is your thinking about how to explain the disconnect between the extreme position that this administration and president has taken on climate? Couldn't be more anti that, and at the same time having, for the first time in 10 years, even though it's only 3, but 3 Republican members of Congress coming forward very publicly supporting this. And what does that, whatever your answer is on that, what does that tell you about what's your thinking about how we're going to break the gridlock and get a bipartisan solution? And if you have any other thoughts for the audience about what Trump voters are thinking about climate, that would be great too. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's no...
I told you.
Yeah, I was great to be here. It's not unique to me to say that we live in a very politically polarized time between the parties, left and right, Democrat, Republican. But I think it's also worth noting that not only are the parties polarized, but within the parties you have kind of internal polarization and fracture on each side. So sometimes, when I go on Twitter and I look at my Democratic friends, it seems like the 2016 primary is still going on, and fans of Bernie and fans of Hillary are fighting each other. And you have a similar dynamic, I think, or analogous on the Republican side of the aisle, where there are different factions that Does the Republican Party stand for free trade, or does it stand for protectionism? There's all sorts of issues that they're being worked out. And one of the things that I think that has led to is kind of a rethinking and maybe a little bit more flexibility for people who, when you're united, there's a lot of issues that, I have some issues that are very important to me politically. And then there's some other issues that, if that's what the party says, maybe you just go along with it and you don't really think about it that much. And when you have this kind of moment that it's not really clear what the party stands for, people can kind of have the freedom to rethink some of these things. And that, I think, is part of what we're seeing here with climate and some Republicans. And how that works out in the future is hard to say. Maybe we can talk more about that in the subsequent conversation. But I think that's what's happening, and I think that has created more freedom for folks like Representative Curbelo or others to kind of go back and think, well, being a conservative doesn't mean that you have to say that the earth isn't getting warmer or anything like that. You can actually apply the same principles that you would apply to healthcare or whatever. You can apply those in the climate context too.
Great. And I just wanted to suggest that whoever's doing the cards, that maybe we can just start them, since we want to have a lot of Q&A in this session.
Cards.
Pardon me? What?
Cards.
Okay, so George, you and your organization have conducted dozens and dozens of Hill visits on pricing carbon, many with Republicans. And we, as as Senator Schatz said, we've known for a long time that there's a lot of Republicans not in Congress that support this. Great economists, former members, et cetera, which is great, and we've been involved with all of those conversations, but it really is very different and very validating when you have a Republican in Congress that's saying, I am a Republican and I want to see a carbon tax, et cetera. So I was, but at the same time, just to continue to try to pose a difficult question, just a few days before the Curbelo bill was introduced, we had the Scalise amendment, and there were only 6 Republicans in the entire House of Congress that didn't vote for a resolution that said carbon taxes are terrible for the economy. So that would be a real mistake to just brush that over and pretend that that didn't happen. So I'm wondering how you square that, and how would, there's some people would say, and I'd love to hear yours or anybody else's comments on this, that the Curbelo bill was a political stunt. It's a one-off. By the way, I'm not saying this, so don't record that I'm saying. I'm asking the difficult question. But people are asking that, and is it really the beginning of something, or just a one-time thing, and how does that fit in with Scalise, et cetera? So you can take it from there.
Well, I think it's a little bit of a straw in the wind. It's when you, as was mentioned before, it's sometimes hard to remember that given the political polarization around climate change in the last 8 or 9 years, where if you're a member of the Republican tribe, you are really not supposed to be enthusiastic about the idea that climate change is a pressing problem. We need to do something aggressive about it. That, in the run-up to the 2008 presidential campaign, that climate was a bipartisan issue, and cap and trade was a Republican idea, and half the senators who were sponsoring legislation were Republicans. So in light of the polarization that's occurred since then, I think it is a little bit ironic, but true, that what's emerged here in the last year or two is that the approach to climate change, carbon tax, carbon pricing, carbon fuel fee, that economists and policy wonks have known forever is the most efficient, certainly the least expensive, most transparent way to address the climate challenge, and which has been regarded for a long time as so politically radioactive, particularly with the Republican being a very anti-tax tribe, is emerging as probably the best and maybe the only way to begin to find some bipartisan support for congressional action. And if we're going to have a national climate policy, if we're going to decarbonize the world's largest economy built on carbon energy and carbon transportation, we're going to have some very aggressive price signals. But of course now, and I say perhaps the only, because there doesn't seem to be much real interest among Democrats or Republicans about a resurrecting cap and trade, looking back to the issues of Waxman-Markey and other systems. And if you, looking forward, if there's one thing that the Trump base, the traditional Republican Party, and a substantial amount of the business community agree on, and will continue to agree on, they don't like regulation. So the idea that Congress is going to come to grips with climate change as public pressure grows in the next couple years through a massive new regulatory program, very unlikely. A carbon tax, on the other hand, a carbon fuel fee, has all these elements that theoretically should appeal to a bipartisan constituency. It's market-based, it can grow the economy, you know, a $30, $35 carbon tax going up a few percent over inflation gets us way past our Paris targets, generates $1.5 or $2 trillion in a very stressed out fiscal situation, can make a lot of regulation obsolete. So what's not to like about that from a bipartisan point of view if you're looking now the next couple of years? As you mentioned, our little team has probably done at least 250 Hill visits in the last 2.5 years, more Republicans than Democrats, a lot of members, majority staff. And as Alex said, what you find, and people who are doing this know, that the significant majority of Republican members of the House and senators think climate change is real, would like to find something. I mean, they're concerned about their grandchildren, you know, would like to find something that their party could do about it, feel very painted into a corner by the political polarization. But, you know, if one person sticks his or her neck out, they'll get, it's suicide. So it has to be, as Senator Whitehouse and others have said, a mass jailbreak. The politics have to change. And what people have said for 2.5 years is what we need is to have constituents, particularly from the business community, business leaders, my constituents, you have to tell me the carbon tax is a good idea. I know this is a good idea. I know this has got bipartisan support, but I have to have business people tell me that they have my back, that this is a good policy, a good fiscal policy as well as a good climate policy. So that, I think, is the key issue here to move this forward. And I would just say, without trying to be too critical, but you know, those of you who've worked in the sort of tech world have heard the expression the valley of death, which is between going from developing a new technology at the bench level to actually scaling it up. That's where 90% of companies fail, because they can't leap, they can't get the funding and to leap across the valley of death. In the case of climate policy, there's a similar valley of death in the business community. Increasingly, the companies who are sponsoring here and people you've heard, a lot of progressive action in the business community on climate within their own companies. So are we trying to be more efficient? We buy more green energy, we'll cut our emissions, we'll deal with our supply chain. Increasingly, large segment of the American business community has been doing that. But to take the leap, but it's a valley of death between that and going out and advocating for public policy. And that's something, unlike in Europe, unlike in Canada, where the business community have gotten very active in public policy, that hasn't happened in the business community in the US yet. And I would say Exelon is a fabulous example of what it takes to do that. But of course, in the run-up to the 2016 election, we found in dealing with maybe 100 different businesses that you know, this was much too political and too partisan. People didn't want to stick their necks out. And since the 2016 election, it's not just on climate issues, but many other issues. You're a business leader, you're a CEO. The last thing you want to do in the world is stick your neck out on an issue that's not critical to your own business and put your finger in the president's eye and get tweeted. So we now are sort of 3 years into a valley of death situation with climate policy. That's going to change, because probably within 2 months, the next generation of climate policy, legislative proposals are going to be on the table. People are going to be putting them together. They're going to be introducing them in a probably, if either house goes Democratic, there's going to be a huge new debate, brand new debate about the future of climate legislation starting in a matter of months. And then the issue for the business community is, in spite of all the progressive things that you've done as a company, in your industry, internally, are you prepared to get out there, jump across the valley of death, and take a public position favoring some sort of aggressive congressional legislation to meet the climate challenge? And that test is coming soon.
I want to say one thing about the Scalise Amendment, which is a non-binding resolution. This is the third time it's been brought up in Congress. The previous two Congress, every single Republican voted for it. This time,
Including Curbelo.
including Curbelo. This time, 6 Republicans voted against it, 1 voted present, 2 chose not to show up and vote, and we know there was a lot of resentment on the Hill that they were being whipped so hard by Scalise to vote for it and that they didn't really give them time to discuss it. So, you know, I think you don't last long in politics if your instincts on shifting political winds aren't good. And I think that's some indication that they're sensing there's something different changing out there, that they can vote in a way that's way different than any Republican had voted.
Okay, thank you. All right. So I wanted to just second or third or fourth George saying that one thing we do here on the Hill a lot, even though policy isn't moving, that members in the middle really need to hear from CEOs of large corporations directly and publicly that they would like legislation to move forward. But I'm going to go to the questions now. I'm trying to sort of group a bunch of them. So I'm going to start with you, Josiah, because you're speaking for all Republicans everywhere.
I should note our street is a nonpartisan organization.
I know.
So I am a Republican, but I'll speak for conservatives. But
Okay, yeah, that's a joke from me. But but here are the questions. Are anti-climate people in Congress more afraid of their constituents or the Tea Party and Koch brothers? What messages would Republican legislatures need to hear, and from whom to get on board with a carbon tax? Who would be the most effective messengers? And then there's a couple sort of funny ones here. You know, how could we, is there a way to make this into an idea? So even if there was a blue wave and something moved forward, how could we get the president to pretend that it was his idea and persuade him that it was his idea? Okay.
all right. Well, very interesting. All right. So you got there's a couple of questions there. I think that in terms of how to get more congressional interest, the biggest problem, as I see it, and this is true certainly for Republicans, but it's also true for a lot of Democrats, is that if you look at the polling on climate issues, the numbers look pretty good, right? Most Americans recognize that climate change is happening. They think that humans are responsible. They're pretty favorable if you poll them on different legislative things, whatever it is, right? But the issue is, it's not a priority issue, right? It's ranks, if you give them 15 options, which are the most important issues, it's like 13, 14, right? So they think about jobs, the economy, some social issues like immigration. That's what gets people's, riled up, right? So because of that, there's not most representatives don't feel like it's worth sticking their neck out or devoting a lot of time to it unless they're either in a very special circumstance or they have a passion about it, I think Representative Curbelo is clear even before he got into politics. He cares deeply about this particular issue, and I think that's probably true of some of the, Senator Whitehouse, for example, right? He doesn't need that issue, right, for an electorally thing. He just really cares about that issue. So that I think is a big, it's not a hostility so much as an apathy thing that is just hard to overcome. In terms of what are some framing, or how do you appeal to conservatives on this? I think we've heard in prior panels, and then George, you mentioned it, some of the things that we've talked about and other people have talked about. One is, how do you use the revenue? Can you use the revenue in ways that people might find appealing, even if they don't care about the climate stuff very much? Efficiency, you mentioned the carbon tax is efficient. One thing that I would say that I don't think has gotten enough stress is that of the different ways to try and address climate change, a carbon tax is the one that best respects individual human freedom and liberty. And what I mean by that is that if you have a carbon tax, you are not telling people you have to use this kind of light bulb, right? You're not telling people you have to drive this kind of car, right? People, each individual gets to decide for themselves how are they going to respond to the price bearing the cost, and how are they going to best reduce their emissions or continue to, find alternatives. They have to pay for it, right? So there's a reality that some things are going to be more expensive. People are not going to want to do it. But it respects the individual choice that each person gets to choose for themselves, as opposed to feeling like someone else is telling me how to live my life, right? So I think that's a key issue there that I don't think we stress enough.
Great, thank you.
Can I respond to that? I think those are good arguments to Republicans whose principal objections are, one, it's taking away my freedom, and two, it's a Democratic plot to grow government expenditure. And then when you say, well, we could give it all back to individual families or in tax, it could be revenue neutral, and the Republican answer is Congress is never going to allow that. Once you get the money in, they're always going to grab it for more government. But I think that if you look at this from a more sort of bipartisan driving the debate point of view, as Alex Flint said, the fact that a carbon tax could be a very good fiscal policy, climate irrelevant, is as we begin to look at a deficit debt that's going way out of whack from World War II, the availability of the money to do infrastructure and to do some debt relief and make individual tax cuts permanent, the availability of this funding, and there isn't anything else that produces this kind of money, could be the most powerful thing in the short term that moves this with Republicans as well as Democrats.
Okay, we only have a couple more minutes. I was going to ask Mark a question and George, but George, you used your time. So because we only have, Richard's telling me just a couple more minutes. So, but thank you very much for that. And I guess just a thing that we're not going to talk about right now, but the one thing I have to respond to that is this idea that Republicans in Congress are going to respond to this fiscal crises, I think is dubious when you see the evidence from the tax bill that was just passed. And I'm just saying that to make the argument that they're going to suddenly really, really care about that was an argument going up before. But anyways, Mark, here's a question for you. How will CCL address Republican defensiveness if Democrats were to take the House and introduce a climate bill or a carbon tax bill? And then with that, we're unfortunately going to have to wrap up just because they want to keep things going here. But
Okay.
you have the last
If
word.
I can just go back to the last question for just a second, is, I just want to say for the BCL, business climate leaders who organize this, Congress needs to hear from businesses. The people on the previous panel were so important. The more we can encourage that to happen, messenger is more important than message. We all need to be encouraging that. Now the question is, if Democrats take it, we know enough about social psychology now to know that if Democrats introduce it, Republicans are against it because Democrats introduced it. And if Republicans introduce it, Democrats are against it because same thing, right? So we all need to work really hard to make sure that anything comes out is a bipartisan bill. It would be a mistake for us to if the Democrats take the House, the Democrats to introduce a bill that's a Democrat-only bill. That would do more damage to the will that we've created, getting the Climate Solutions Caucus working together, than a lot of other things. So I think that for people who are on the left, you've got to work really hard if your member gets elected to say, we need a bipartisan solution, not a Democratic solution.
Okay, terrific. Well, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.